Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you all are. Thank you for joining us today for this informational session. My name is Jonathan Yakasha from Tech Connect. I'll be your host today. Today, we are talking about spaceports. We are joined by Scott McLaughlin from Spaceport America. We are going to take the first roughly half of our time today with me asking Scott some questions. Hopefully, you've got your questions as well. Please feel free to submit them at any point during today's conversation via the Q&A chat box. We'll spend the last half of our time getting to your questions. So with that, let's get underway. Uh, Scott, real easy one to start off for you. Let's talk about spaceports. What do they do? What's their primary function?
Well, thanks for having me, Jonathan. This will be a fun conversation. So,
Yes.
what is a spaceport? Well, you can't go to space without a spaceport. That's the answer to that. We can stop now because there's nothing else that can happen without a spaceport. But um, no, spaceports are they're actually called launch sites by the FAA. We're considered a launch site operator, and they license the spaceports, although it's complicated because if you go into the past, you have NASA, the Kennedy Space Center, you have a NASA side, they call it, and then you have what used to be the Air Force side, which is now the Space Force side. And those were federal launch sites. So if you think back to Apollo days and things, we didn't call them spaceports. They were just federal launch sites. Like Vandenberg and Wallops Island, which is a NASA. But in 1984, the Congress passed the law, the Commercial Space Launch Act, which allowed there to be commercial space. Before then, everything was really a federal activity, whether it was a rocket, whether it was NASA, whether it was military, even satellites. It might have been a commercially built satellite, but it was usually being built for NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NASA, and put on a rocket, right? And it went to space. But after 1984, a company like SpaceX could exist. They could build their own rocket, they could build their own rocket engines, and they could fly their own rockets. But that same federal law eventually allowed for there to be a launch site designation. So that's what we are. We're a launch site operator. We applied for a license um, about 2006. We had to do an environmental impact statement. We had to do a bunch of things when we secure the land. In our case, we even had to have an agreement with the U.S. Army White Sands Missile Range, which is right next door to us. But that allows us to host multiple companies on a single site for suborbital or orbital space missions.
Okay. And for those of you who are perhaps not familiar, that flag in the background there behind Scott is the flag of New Mexico. Spaceport America is located in the southeast corner of New Mexico, the
Yeah,
land of
thank
enchantment. All right. So, uh, how do you see the role of spaceports in the commercial space industry?
Well, going back to Kennedy and Space Center in Florida, there now is an entity that's been around for a number of years called Space Florida, and so you have the NASA side, you have the Air Force, or actually Space Force side, but now you have some launch pads, and you have the old shuttle landing facility, the runway, run by Space Florida. And what that means, when you have a commercial spaceport, what that means is that it's like an airport. Instead of it just being a federal range that's doing federal missions and federal things, it's now a place like an airport that can have different airlines come and go and have different activities come and go that are on the commercial side that really aren't in the province of the federal government necessarily, right? So so we have the ability to do horizontal launches or vertical launches, but these are not necessarily federal missions. I mean, some of the things we've handled would be considered federal, but our biggest customer is Virgin Galactic, and they went to space 7 times last year with commercial astronauts with passengers. And so the role of a commercial spaceport is to start supporting all the new commercial activities that are taking place in space. So there's commercial spaceports. There's one designated in Oklahoma, one in Midland, Texas, one outside of Denver, one in Mojave. But we're unique because we're actually designed from the ground up as a spaceport. The site selection and everything about the spaceport was very uniquely done for a spaceport, whereas some of these other sites that I just talked about are airports or county airports or are near cities that are actually um, have other functions besides trying to go to space or doing space related activities.
Okay, I want to tease a little bit further out that airport analogy that you just used. So if a commercial space company comes to you and says, well, we're going to launch from this other site, but we need to land at your site, is that something that works for you guys, or is it more of a up from here, down here kind of situation?
Well, you'll find that the space regulations and regulatory law is still a wild frontier. There's the 1968 Act, I forget what that's called, but the International Treaty about Space. But I'll give you a quick example. The SpaceX capsule that took the astronauts on a roughly polar orbit. I don't know when that was, like 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. So the FAA regulated the launch, but they regulated the launch because there's overflight there, that people nearby the launch site can get hurt, right? But there's actually an exemption for the astronauts that flew on that SpaceX capsule. And once they got into orbit, there was no regulation for them at all. And then once they had a reentry, now again the FAA, there were regulations about how the reentry would occur. But what the FAA was protecting was again what are called non-involved, the non-involved public on the ground. So there's a lot of weird still regulations that are still happening, that are still being created because this commercial marketplace is being created. But in the case you gave, when Virgin Galactic flies at the spaceport, they take off and eventually Spaceship Two lands at the spaceport. So it's considered a single activity and falls under a suborbital launch. But if someone took off, say, at another spaceport and landed at our spaceport, that would be considered a reentry. And so they would have to have a license both for the spaceport that it launched out of. They'd have to have a license for the vehicle that it can launch safely. And then we, on the reentry side, would have to have our reentry license, which we're working on right now. By the way, we've submitted that to the FAA. And the vehicle would have to be licensed to reenter at Spaceport America. So there would be 4 bits of regulation to do what you said, as opposed to really just 2 for what Virgin Galactic does, and is going to be doing regularly here in about a year.
So possible, just quite a bit more complicated in order to pull it all off.
It is complicated. We're in what's called right now a learning period. And that learning period, I forget how many years it goes back to, but the FAA through Congress basically said, we're not going to regulate commercial passengers in space. We're not going to regulate severely, things like how to build a capsule or how to build a space plane. And if you go back in time a little bit, FAA or NASA was always very, very heavily NASA was very heavily involved in how the capsule was designed, the Boeing capsule, even the Dragon capsule, in terms of prescriptive designs. In other words, the government was directly involved in decision making. Right, that doesn't happen anymore. The Dragon capsule was built by SpaceX under their own specifications with government oversight, because a lot of the government programs going to the space station, for example, the government was paying the ride. But Virgin Galactic, for example, built Spaceship Two, and the experience and everything that happens, it's actually kind of exempt from FAA regulations right now. So it will be more like a 737, or it will be more like the regulations that are on what are called type certified aircraft. But right now, it really is kind of a unique period for space and commercial passengers in space.
Okay, all right. And talking about the regulations a little bit, but more broadly, I guess my next question is going to be, how and when do you engage with a commercial space company? Is it they come out to you? Is it you reach out to them? How and when does that process begin, and what does that look like?
So Spaceport America is an agency of the state of New Mexico. If you go look at other commercial spaceports, you might find that some of them are part of a county, they're part of the city. Las Vegas now is working on maybe one of the world's first purely private companies. But even as a state agency running a facility that the state of New Mexico built and maintains, we actually have a business development department, and so just like a commercial company, we go out and we look for companies that can, do business with us and operate out of Spaceport America. And we go to conferences, we set up a booth often, and we talk to a lot of these companies. So what's happening again at the Cape and in Vandenberg is the cadence has picked up so dramatically that we're going to get to a point in the next few years where a new young company that wants to launch their rocket at the Cape is not going to be able to find a launch pad or find a launch window. So they're going to have to go to commercial spaceports. And so we're talking to a lot of those companies right now about launching vertically and horizontally out of New Mexico.
Okay. And at what point in that commercial space company's development process do you guys typically get involved? Is it relatively early stage so that they can kind of build to your opportunities, or is it they come to you once they're like ready to go?
Well, there's some interesting gaps in and how this is going to work for what will eventually be inland launch. So most of the companies we talk to are simply building a vertical rocket that is a 2 or 3 stage that's going to take off on the coast and launch over water. And so they don't have what's called overflight issues, and overflight meaning that they fly over people and over population centers, right? 737s fly over people all the time. We're used to the idea that airplanes fly directly overhead, helicopters and Cessna 172s, but we're also used to the idea that they crash every once in a while. But when one of those airplanes crashes, we don't shut down the entire system. We're depending again on the federal government and the regulations to come up with some sort of standard that things are not infinitely safe, which would mean you could never get them off the ground, but that they're safe enough and that we can
Mhm.
all agree with the risk. So for the companies, a lot of the companies we talk to, they're designing their system to fly out of the Cape, and that means it flies over water. But for the newer companies we're talking to, we're now starting to talk to them about, well, if you're going to eventually fly from an inland spaceport, you're going to have to fly over people. And if you're going to have to fly over people, your level of safety, your ability to abort, some of the systems on board may need to be redundant. And you can't do things like have a stage separation where you shed a bunch of parts that just fall into the ocean, like explosive bolts or an intercoupler. You're not going to be able to do that. You can't just throw stuff on the ground as you're flying over. That's not what 737s do, right? So we are trying to get to them, and we're also trying to talk to folks in the federal government, particularly DoD, about this idea that eventually you are going to want to do inland launch. And if you're going to do inland launch, whether it's horizontal or vertical, you are going to have to look at the vehicle a little differently, and you're going to have to come up with abort modes and safe modes and things that will allow it to not make orbit, but still land and not crash, not explode, like we saw in Wallops Island, I think 2 or 3 years ago when I forget what it was, took off and basically blew up. They had to blow it up. We don't want to do that as we're going over
Yeah,
Texas. Texas wouldn't like that very much.
no, not so much. So it sounds like at least in theory, a commercial space company would want to would want to decide relatively early on in their process whether they're going to be an inland flight or an inland launch or more of an ocean launch, and then begin to map out the impacts that that decision has on their technology.
Yeah, exactly. And the technology changes and even the operations may and probably will increase the cost and probably reduce the payload a little bit. So that changes the market, the dynamics of the market. So now they need a customer who, for whatever reason, might be willing to pay a little more. And that's hard right now, especially with SpaceX and the Falcon 9 doing what it does. So we think one of the things people need to start thinking about, for example, is if the hurricane that Helene had hit the Cape instead of around the Tampa area, what would have happened to the Cape, especially if there were a lot of damage, or super heavy, or not super heavy, but a Starship operating out of the Cape has a huge hazard area, and it's been in the paper that hazard area extends over Blue Origin's launch site. So now they're going to be fighting about operations, not just about launch, because a lot of times it's not about launch; it's about tanking and test and doing things on site. So, um, but if say there were an explosion there and you lost a couple pads or you weren't able to operate there, and then you needed to go to space, well, how are you going to go to space if you don't have that launch site available? So we think that in terms of DoD, the federal government, they ought to be willing to maybe pay a little bit more for some launches and some technology evolution that would allow an inland launch site to happen.
Okay. You've talked a couple of times about the various um, facilities that you guys have. Do you guys specialize in working with commercial space companies that are launch providers versus satellite manufacturers? Do you guys have a particular niche that you like to stay in?
Well, I mean, our biggest facility is our 12,000 foot by 200 foot concrete runway, which was, built to be able to handle the Virgin Galactic White Knight 2. But we're also on 18,000 acres, kind of in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, kind of close to the city of Truth or Consequences. I live in Las Cruces, not that far away, an hour away. But we have our 18,000 acres, we have an advanced technology area. So that's in the south part. We have spin launch, which you've probably read about. So they're working on a centrifuge system. The one here is not orbital, it's suborbital. Hopefully we'll be doing some testing again soon. Then we have an area that's a vertical launch site, but we don't have a lot of infrastructure. So again, for us, we're still kind of a green field for a lot of that, for a lot of launch activity. And when you're talking to the small launch providers, we're going to have to get some ground service equipment in. We don't produce oxygen on site. We don't have a lot of hangars or extra buildings right now. So we're still in an evolution to try and get ahead of the market and have things available so they can come here and operate. But I think there is a demand signal. I think that again, you'd asked before that how often do we talk to some of these providers, and we're talking to them weekly. Whether they're going to do suborbital tests or whether they're thinking about doing orbital operations someday.
Okay. And actually, you sort of lead in really nicely to my very next question. When it comes to talking to a commercial space company, um, are you guys able to facilitate introductions between that particular company and something that they didn't realize that they needed? Hey, we're building this, we're building a brand new satellite, but we haven't figured out what our launch vehicle is. Can you guys help us figure that out? Is that something you guys do too?
We don't do too much of that, but we're when you think about folks who run an airport, they're not necessarily pilots, right? And they're also
Hmm.
not aerodynamic or aeronautical engineers, and we're the same way. I'm an electrical engineer and a business person, and we have some aerospace engineers here. But our goal is to run and grow the spaceport. But New Mexico is really growing in terms of space. In fact, a new coalition, a new thing started just a few months ago. We call it the Space Valley Foundation or the Space Valley Coalition, and we're trying to do kind of what you said. We have El Paso south of us that's got a great aerospace economy that's starting to grow. We have Albuquerque to the north of us, same thing, trying to get everybody connected. And so when these new companies come to New Mexico, we will give them a tour of the spaceport, but often we will also introduce them to folks up in Albuquerque, which includes Kirtland Air Force Base, Space Force, Air Force, Sandia National Laboratories, Los Alamos National Laboratories, and then our universities. And the same thing, because if we're really going to be an orbital spaceport, we're going to need that ecosystem of activity around us that you're talking about, whether it's processing satellites, building satellites, or processing vehicles. That's all going to have to occur in the local region for us to be able to support orbital launch.
Okay, so not quite yet, but on the horizon, so to speak.
Yep, we're working at it.
Okay, all right. So let's say I represent a commercial space company, and I've come to you and said, Scott, I'd like to use your facility. What kinds of information does a commercial space entity need to be prepared to share with you?
Well, a surprising a lot of material. Like we really want to understand the complete operation, the complete footprint. We need to understand timelines. We need to understand the number of people on site. We need to understand if there's any safety or risk. And then things are divided up in the phases a lot of times. So when companies come out to work with us, there may be kind of a commissioning phase where they're just bringing their people, and we have to worry about things coming into the area. And at the same time, we have to then look at this sort of build-up phase where maybe they're getting ready to do something. And then there's the event, the actual event, whatever it is. And I'll give you an example. We have three companies that are doing high altitude platform systems, so HAPS. So a high altitude platform system is a very large UAS that can fly 60,000 feet and above. And the companies that we're talking to, AeroVironment is building the biggest vehicle, is designed to take off, get up to 60,000 feet, and then with solar cells, it will stay up for 6 months at a time. So, and these other companies are doing the same thing, and they're trying to get them FAA certified. So they show up on site, and they get a lot of people, and they're building the vehicle or doing stuff, and we got to keep tabs on everything that's happening and whether they need any resources. But then the day of the event, the day of the launch, it's a whole another scenario because we need to manage the airspace, which we do with the FAA and White Sands Missile Range, and we need to understand if there's hazards and other things going on. So our team likes to get the whole concept of operations, the whole ConOps from the beginning to the end, and then we start talking about it. Well, do we have the space for it? Are you going to build something? How much is it going to cost? So it's a lot of details. It's a lot of work.
Okay. Speaking of timelines, roughly how long does that kind of initial conversation take from first introduction to yes, we're ready to go?
If we wanted it all to go very fast, it could take just a few months. Really, what happens is that give and take you were talking about. We do wind up asking questions of the customer that maybe they hadn't thought about. So then they got to take it back to their design engineers or take it back to the folks working on logistics. And that usually chews up a week or two. And then they come back and say, okay, this is how much power we need, for example, how much electrical power. And so there's a lot of going back and forth. And then usually there's another negotiation period where we say, well, this is how much it's going to cost you. And we can't do it for free. And then that takes a little while. So we're seeing anywhere from 2 to 6 months in terms of trying to move quickly, both on our side and the customer moving quickly. But we're also talking to some customers about some larger, bigger programs that may require some infrastructure. And I anticipate that's going to be more like a year-long discussion of how to get what they need on site and then get it built and get ready for them.
Okay. So it's not a quick turnaround, contact you on Monday and launch on Friday kind of scenario.
No, and part of that is actually because of if you're talking about going suborbital or doing reentry, like I said, we're working on the reentry side too. Part of that is because you have to go to the FAA and you have to demonstrate to them that your operation and your vehicle is safe, and that has been taking a long time. And the FAA has been very, very busy with all the commercial space aspects, and so that, and I'm not blaming them at all. They don't have, they've not, the amount of activity that they manage has gone way up, but the staff that they need has not been approved by Congress. So they're working as hard as they can, but they have to make sure the public stays safe. So if we have someone, let's invent a quick customer, they're going to do a guided liquid fueled rocket from Spaceport America. Well, that means the thing could go anywhere theoretically, right? So now you have all kinds of things you need to worry about, like, well, how are we going to keep it from going everywhere, and what is the technology, and what kind of fuels are on board? Are those fuels dangerous? How are you going to abort? Is there a safety system? Are we going to track it? Are we going to use some radar and telemetry? So there's just a lot of details. So unless it's a very simple customer, maybe a small solid rocket, it will be several weeks to months before we can get everything parameterized and everybody's happy with what's going to happen, including FAA and White Sands Missile Range.
Okay. For those of you who are listening in, thank you very much for the questions that you have submitted. We will get to those in just a little bit. If you have additional questions, please avail yourself of the opportunity here. We literally have experts on spaceports here today to talk to you about spaceports. So if you have an interest in learning more about it because maybe you'd like to get something into space or a suborbital flight, that would be a good opportunity to get some information. All right, so my last two questions for you. First off, what do you see as the future of spaceports?
I think once we do have vehicles that are a little bit safer and more reliable, we're going to start talking about spaceports around the country that can launch inland and do more tests. But that's probably 10 or 20 years away before it becomes super routine. In the meantime, I think sites like ours that are remote sites and with a sparse population are probably going to handle some of those very first vehicles. And but spaceports are definitely going to evolve. There's still a lot of economics. I think if you read the the trade rags reaction engines just went out of business, and they were working on a new supersonic engine concept. Maybe out of bankruptcy, someone will buy it, but it's an industry that is very difficult to keep going, because it takes so long to get to revenue. And when you have a leader like SpaceX that got so far ahead of everybody and is kind of sucking up all the oxygen in the room, it's hard for the small companies to keep moving. But I think it will happen because we keep finding new applications to do things in space, whether in our case right now is space tourism, and there'll be space tourism up in orbit as well. But we're talking, I think, two or three different capsule companies that want to bring home materials that are going to be manufactured in space, or drugs that are going to be manufactured in space. So, and then I think there's 3 or 4 space stations being worked on right now, private space stations. So spaceports will eventually fulfill this very important role of allowing commodities to go to space and allowing commodities to come back from space. And it won't all depend on the Cape, basically. It won't all depend on Florida or Wallops or Vandenberg.
Okay. My last question. You've talked a little bit about Virgin Galactic. What's kind of your favorite Spaceport America success story?
Well, I think, it's cliche to say space is hard, but space really is hard. I think the space shuttle is probably still considered one of the most complicated vehicles ever devised and built and flown. But for me, I think it was seeing the pilots, what was the test mission before Sir Richard Branson go to space, and that was in May, I think 3 years ago, where we got to go outside and see the White Knight take off and see it happen, see him go to space, hear the sonic booms when they turned around and started to come back home, and then have them land. So that was a long time coming, much longer than anybody thought, for either Virgin Galactic or the state of New Mexico, and a lot of the people around here who are grumpy about a lot of their taxpayer dollars going to help get the spaceport off the ground. But it was pretty symbolic and pretty exciting. I was happy to be a part of that.
Okay. All right. All right. We're going to turn to questions from the audience. We're going to take the rest of our time, folks, to answer your questions. So put them into the Q&A box. If we run out of questions before we run out of time, we'll wrap a little bit early. But honestly, I would love to run out of time before we run out of questions. So please take advantage of the opportunity. Scott's here to answer questions. With that, let's get to the very first one. So question is, who grants the license to launch site operators?
So that's FAA. So there's a formal process. You can look on the FAA, the commercial space section of the FAA site, and there's what's called a Part 420 license. I think it's Part 420, and so there's a lot of requirements, and the FAA, it's considered a federal action, so it falls under NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. So we have to do environmental impact and a statement, and we also had to work with a lot of local partners. We have the BLM, we have the county, we have the state of New Mexico, various departments. So once you put that huge package together and do everything you need to, and part of it is you have to simulate, on paper at least, a launch of some sort of vehicle from your spaceport and show that you can do it safely. So if you try to do that from the middle of Dallas, Texas, you wouldn't be able to show that because the risk would be too high. There's just too many people. But if you're in a remote location, you can show that, yes, a vehicle could theoretically have a problem on the way up, but we're remote enough and the population is low enough that density wise that we can do that. So all of that gets submitted to the FAA, and then they chew on it for a while, and then they issue a license. So that's where we get the launch site operator license.
Our next question, in terms of services and materials for the spaceport, do you provide gantries, pads, taxiways, movers, or is it just space, physical space for that launch company?
Right now, we don't provide any of that. Right now, we don't have any of that. And that's a big question about how to go forward in the future. So if you go to the Kennedy Space Center, or you go to Wallops, you'll find that an awful lot of the infrastructure that is there, even some that SpaceX is using, is infrastructure that was originally built by the federal government. We don't have that benefit. The state of New Mexico basically created the site. We put in the electricity and the water, fiber optic, and we have our own fire department, our own EMS and security. But in terms of building a gantry, we don't have any of that. And the rub there comes from, well, what would you build if you were going to build it? Would you build it for Firefly? Would you build it for SpaceX? Would you build it for Relativity or ABL? There's no interoperability between any of these launch providers right now. Everybody does things in their own way, and that's a real problem for the growth of spaceports. So imagine, if every airplane that came to an airport had its own means, very unique means of fueling it or taking even the sewage out of the airplane or something, it would be very difficult. But what's happened over the years is we have a lot of standardization within the commercial airline business. Well, we don't have any standardization for vertical launch providers yet. So that makes the answer to that question very difficult, because what would you build if you built it? So that's another thing where I think DoD could maybe lend some help by saying, okay, we want the capability to do inland launch, but we don't want to and we want to pay for some of that, and we want to help get the ball rolling, but we need some interoperability. We need some of the vertical launch providers to agree on some things about how that would occur, and so that a spaceport could handle, with one gantry can handle, say, two or three different types of launch providers.
Okay. So before we get to our next question, that question of interoperability, is there a is there a consortium of spaceport operators that is basically making that case to NASA, to DoD, to large commercial space companies of, if y'all can agree on some basic standards, that makes our jobs easier, which makes your jobs easier.
Yeah, I think recently Mars, Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport, and some other spaceports we weren't directly involved this go around, is trying to set some standards. They would be good for anybody. They would be good for the industry, and that definitely needs to happen. We're certainly making that case every time we talk to anybody who can do something about it. But there's this balance between the government, for example, the federal government imposing a standard versus, the launch providers coming up with their own standard. But there's not a lot of incentive for the launch providers to come up with the standard right now. Especially again, if you're SpaceX or you're Blue Origin and you kind of already have your launch site figured out and you've already built your gantry and you've already done all your stuff, why would you want to make it easier for a competitor necessarily? But for the smaller launch providers, they were going to fill a lot of the niche roles and want to be mobile to be able to launch, say, at Spaceport America or Vandenberg and move around. Definitely, we have to get to the point where we have some standards and some interoperability. So there's also some standards type groups working on what a standard spaceport is, but I don't know that anybody's working specifically on exactly how to, for example, do methane or oxygen, what that standard looks like and what a gantry would look like. The same as what happens in the airport when the fuel truck just rolls up and parks underneath the airplane. So we're still a little ways away from that.
Okay. Our next question is a little bit more speculative. Are either the Great Lakes, Michigan, wide enough for launch downrange to be considered overwater launch ranges? Is that something you could speak to?
Well, I mean, Michigan was Michigan Aero. I think it was called Michigan Aerospace Consortium or something. Michigan Aerospace Industry. I forget what the full name is, but they were working on a spaceport that would do exactly that. And I think fundamentally it works. You could do it, but you're still back to, well, what happens if you don't make it to orbit? Are you going to crash into Lake Michigan with a tank full of kerosene? Are you going to blow up and scatter little parts everywhere? What about the fishermen? What about people in the water? And Michigan maybe isn't going to have quite the weather that we have in New Mexico, so your business model changes. Where like Alaska is a great place to do polar and sun synchronous airport at Kodiak, but there are times of the year it's going to be hard to operate. So these spaceports, all the commercial spaceports, us included, are trying to figure out that matrix of profitability, creating good jobs, and whether we can actually do that. But so to answer the question, fundamentally, yeah, that you could launch over Lake Michigan. That I think that was studied, and it was agreed that technically you could do it. But now you got to get through the political side of it, right? Are people have environmental concerns? What about the noise from a launch? What happens if you're about to launch and you explode instead? You got to worry about overpressure effects and other things. So it's a complicated thing to get a spaceport built. That's why I'm lucky we're through that part of it here in New Mexico.
Scott, you're really good at this. You actually anticipated one of the next questions that I've got here. You mentioned the weather and the climate. The next question that I've got here is the climate important? Basically, a dry atmosphere versus a very humid one. Does that play a role into your overall operations?
Yeah, it plays a big role. We like to say we have 340 days of sunshine, although sometimes it's a little cold and sometimes it's a little windy. But it makes a big impact on how much you can fly. One of the most important things for us is we don't have salt air. So if you've ever worked at the Cape, and I did some things at the Cape, even stainless steel rust when you get it in terms of a salt air environment. So maintaining the things that are happening at the Cape is a ongoing process. Things are corroding all the time, and when things are corroding, you have electrical problems. You might have mechanical problems. So in New Mexico, people park their car from the pickup they drove in high school, and it sits out there for 40, 50 years, and it's just a little rustier than it was 50 years ago, but nothing major. But the other thing we have going for us is we're at about 4,200 feet above sea level at Spaceport America. So Colorado likes to say you get the first mile for free at their spaceport. We kind of say the same thing, that you get the first 4,200 feet for free. Doesn't have quite the ring, but it makes a difference in the
A
fact
little
that you're
longer.
already a little longer. You're higher up, so and that's going to be a factor. It kind of pays you back a little bit in terms of maybe some other cost in terms of operating from an inland site.
Okay. Um, Next one here goes a little bit towards the regulations for materials launched. Um, Question is, would you please advise about the regulations for transportation requirements for nuclear material to space, a nuclear battery going up to space? Are there specific regulations that directly impact the spaceport?
I have not had to deal with that yet. I know that those regulations exist, so I know when they did the thermal pile type things like in Voyager, that there's some pretty hefty regulations about doing that. Now, if you were to do it inland, you're going to have to again prove safety, but now instead of just proving safety for things falling on the ground or maybe a toxic chemical, whether it's going to evaporate before it gets on ground level, you're going to have to prove the nuclear part of it too, that you're not going to disperse something that would be dangerous. So, but I think nuclear is handled differently though. But so I don't know how that would happen at the spaceport. That might be something that can only happen at the over the ocean for a while longer.
Okay. Um, you mentioned that Spaceport America is a division of the New Mexico state government. Are there are there funding opportunities through the state to help a small business, small space company uh, access your facility? Is that something that exists?
Yeah, they do exist, but they we can't just pick a company and say, well, we like you as a partner. We're going to give you some money. That shows a kind of favoritism that is not allowed by us. So what are set up are a lot of things, actually mostly through the economic development department of the state of New Mexico, and they're more standard type things. Like if you bring a factory to New Mexico, the state will help you pay for training, or they'll help you do tax abatement for 10 years or something. There are a few extra things associated with the spaceport. For example, there's not a sales tax, a gross receipts tax on payloads. Um, and there's a few other things that come with some tax abatements and operating at the spaceport. But we do have a little bit of flexibility. So if there's a company that wants to do something specific, we always recommend come talk to us right away to figure out whether you can do the activity at the spaceport. And then we'll right away introduce you to our economic development secretary, who has the domain over those sort of incentives and can try and work a deal with you to get you to be able to operate out of the spaceport or locate in New Mexico.
Okay, all right. Um, let's see. Our next question. Next question is a bit more about dealing with the non-commercial space people. How do you advantages of the commercial spaceport? How do you convince people that the state of New Mexico funding the spaceport is a worthwhile investment?
Oh, that's a rough one. The way I like to look at it is you can look at a spaceport the same way you would look at a port. on a coast, or you would look on a significant bridge. If you were going to build a bridge across the Mississippi, especially if you go back a long time ago, you're not going to find any private company that has the resources to build that bridge. What you have to do is you have to involve governments that can gather the resources, build the bridge, knowing that the way it pays for itself is in terms of economic development and jobs and things that you can't always measure, that you can't always get your money back. But that's still the purpose of government, to do that sort of thing. So if you look at airports, airports are owned by the cities, and actually, I've heard it said many times that the only two places that make money at an airport are the parking and the food court. But you can't be a major city without a major airport. It just doesn't work that way, right? So the city of Denver, city of Albuquerque, they own those airports. They maintain those airports. They do what they can to collect fees from the passengers and from the airlines to build up and maintain those airports. But you don't look at the airport as a revenue generating part of the city of Albuquerque, for example. You don't go and you say, well, how many millions did we make off the airport? Because you realize that that's not the airport's purpose. The airport's purpose is to make the whole region a viable center for business, and it's good for families and stuff, and a good place to live. And so the spaceport is the same thing. And we're at an early stage where we can't claim that we pay for ourselves, although we're actually paying about 60% of our bill right now, in terms of our maintenance and operations. But really, it's to drive the economic development in the area, and especially once we start going with orbital providers, there should be several thousand jobs associated with the spaceport, and that is how we're trying to. It will pay back the cost that was originally borne by the taxpayer.
Okay, all right. Our next question jumps back a little bit, asking whether or not there are international standards at play in commercial spaceport operations.
Again, really, they're not right now. If you look at each spaceport, they typically some area of the world, and including the United States, someone says, "Hey, we should have a spaceport," and they go, "Well, nobody knows how to do that, right?" So they hire companies that are specialized in design of airports and spaceports. A lot of times, those companies go in and they start consulting, and they figure out, well, here's where you could go to orbit. We've done some analysis about trajectory. Here's where you can go to orbit. Here's a site. By the way, this is how much power you're going to need. You need to start thinking about commodities like fuel. So it's actually a lot of times it's these companies that design the spaceport, but they do that all around the country and around the world. So a lot of the quote unquote standardization is coming from the fact that those companies are actually doing a lot of the overall design. But unfortunately, it still doesn't include the really detailed interoperability things that we were talking about before. So it gets you the space and the land and some buildings and a general idea place where you can operate, but you're still not to the point where, Firefly can fly one afternoon, and 2 days later, someone else can use the same pad and the same gantry to fly.
Okay. Next question. Are there any air monitoring or noise monitoring requirements or needs that you guys have?
We're kind of lucky. So we're under this very large airspace complex that has been run by the U.S. Army for White Sands Missile Range for 60 years, and they explode stuff on their side of the mountain out there, and they have sonic booms, and the ranchers in the area have been used to that for decades and decades. So we have to be environmentally sensitive, and we have to do things that are appropriate, and we do let ranchers know if we're going to do a liquid engine test or we're going to do a solid engine test, and there's going to be a lot of noise. But we don't have any, we so far have not had to do any measurements to prove anything. People, again, are kind of used to sonic booms, and it's just part of what happens out there.
Okay. All right. We don't have any additional questions at this point. I'll give everybody a chance to kind of digest what Scott has been saying and toss in any additional questions. Scott, I'll ask you, in a given year, how many launches do you guys typically have?
Well, it's been growing every year. We did 7 what are called licensed launches with Virgin Galactic in the past, I think 12 months approximately, or 14 months. But we have other providers that do things. And then we just have all kinds of other events. We have those high altitude platform systems. We had Spaceport America Cup where we had tons of launches. We do race car testing, come out on the runway every once in a while. So it's just a continuum of different things. Our goal definitely is orbital launch and reentry, which we're getting closer and closer to. And then we hope that will be something on the order of a big event at least once a month. But Virgin Galactic is eventually going to be flying a couple times a week. So it'll be a busy place in the coming years.
All right. So basically, if people want to use Spaceport America, they need to start scheduling their time sooner rather than later.
Oh yeah, we don't mind. That'd be good.
In terms of scheduling, our very next question is, what would be the best way to reach out to you guys?
Well, spaceportamerica.com is a website, and you can find me and my coworkers on LinkedIn. That's always a great way to get in contact with us. And then the best thing is to come out and we'll show you around. It's a really hard place to understand because we are really in a very remote kind of area and with a lot of space. So we really like to get the customers out there to kind of come out and they can imagine for themselves what they can do out there.
Okay. So a commercial space company deciding that they want to reach out to a spaceport, what kinds of information should they have at the ready or be working to develop in order to share that with you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things we'll do is we'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, which is saying that we won't share any of their information with anybody, and they don't share our information necessarily with anybody. Um, and then once we get that and we kind of get through an initial, greeting of understanding each other, then we start getting into the details. So really, just a detailed PowerPoint, detailed manual of what the concept of operations looks like, what is considered hazardous. We really want to dig into whatever is hazardous and understand any safety, any risk elements, and that includes things like if there would be some sort of toxic chemical, or even just a fuel. But we have smart guys here, aerospace engineers, who work through all that with the companies. And like I said, 2 to 6 months, we're hopefully getting close to where they can actually do their operations, depending on what they are.
Okay. Uh, Next question. Is a virtual tour a possibility? Understanding that it wouldn't capture all of the detail, but to at least give them the flavor of what it's like out there.
Yeah, we did like with a 360 camera, we did some of that. So I think on our YouTube channel we have some of that there, and on our spaceportamerica.com website we have some of that there. And so you can kind of look around a little bit. But if you've been to New Mexico and you've seen the wide open desert, high desert, then you kind of already know what it looks like. With mountains and beautiful sunrises and sunsets. And
Absolutely.
then, yeah, and if someone couldn't show up but they wanted to know more, we could always get on the phone with them and just show them.
All right, fantastic. Scott, as I said earlier, you are anticipating the questions. Somebody wanted me to confirm that your website was spaceportamerica.com, and you've already done that, so that's perfect. We are out of questions at the moment. We are just about out of time, maybe a little bit over. More than happy to give people a second here to get your questions in. If you do go out to Spaceport America, think about this question: red or green? It'll be important when you get out to New Mexico. They'll explain it to you. Think about it. It's very important. Okay. I'm just going to tease that there. Hopefully people, when they reach out to you, Scott, will say, all right, the guy from Tech Connect was talking about red or green. What did he mean by that? What impact does it have on our launch capabilities and all that sort of good stuff? People will keep that in mind. All right, we don't have any additional questions, folks. I'm going to give you just another moment here to answer ask some questions, because I don't want to keep Scott any longer than we have to, but I think he wants to answer questions if you've got them, and I would love to read them out to him if you do. And I'm not seeing anybody come in. Oh, of course, waited to the last second. All right. Okay, so there is no ICAO or FAA equivalent standards.
No, ICAO applies to airport, international, and civil aviation, I think, organization, and FAA. There are standards. I mean, the FAA, we have standards we have to abide by for explosives and how we deal with explosives, response times, FAA standards still apply for any, we use our runway for, it's a private airport, but a lot of our customers fly people in, and we can support a lot of activities. So we still have FAA standards on the aviation side. But on the spaceport side, the regulations are a little different. They're not as hard set yet as you might expect, and that's because there's no standardization of vehicles, there's no standardization of operations, and because we're in this, like I talked about, this learning period, this exemption period for space flight participants. So it's still kind of an evolving field. But if you go look at what I mentioned, the Part 420 on the FAA site, you will see that there's still a significant amount of things we have to do to prove to FAA that we can safely operate a spaceport.
Okay. All right, folks, I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you to our attendees for taking some time today to learn about spaceports. This was a great conversation, due in no small part to the questions that you folks were asking. So thank you very much for that. To Scott and Ronnie, Ronnie was our kind of unseen contributor here. So thank you both very much for taking some time out of your day to talk to our attendees about spaceports and the role that you guys play in the commercial space enterprise. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and hope to see you again soon on another webinar. Thanks. Bye-bye.